To the next session. Our keynote speaker will be Carol Gould, and she will talk about interactive democracy, followed by a comment from Rowan Cruft. Carol is Distinguished Professor in the Philosophy Department at Hunter College and in the doctoral programs in Philosophy and Political Science at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, where she is also Director of the Center for Global Ethics and editor of the Journal of Social Philosophy. Gould is the author of Marxist Social Ontology from 1978, Rethinking Democracy from 1988, Globalizing Democracy and Human Rights from 2004, which won the 2009 David Easton Book Award from the Foundations of Political Theory section of the American Political Science Association. So we have kind of two prize winners here. Your book also won, I think, an APSA prize. She has received fellowships and grants from the Rockefeller Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Science Foundation, the Fulbright Commission, and the Woodrow Wilson International Centers for Scholars. Carol, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for this invitation and this very interesting, I suppose I should enhance it. I do apologize for being rather jet-lagged, so I can blame all my errors on that. Interestingly, I ran into the fellow setting up the coffee, and I told him we were discussing problems of democracy, and he said, "Oh, is there any?" Meaning democracy. So that sort of makes my point. Just going to start with a bit of reading and then summarize, because it's a rather long paper, and I'd be glad to send it around. So citizens in liberal democratic societies have become spectators to political processes largely out of their control. Is this on? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. This is especially so in the United States, perhaps, where powerful moneyed interests have gained enormous control over electoral outcomes, especially in view of recent Supreme Court decisions, Citizens United and the McCutcheon case, which have allowed practically unlimited campaign contributions, as well as the funding of ongoing large-scale media campaigns. So you've heard of the Koch brothers and their who represent oil and coal interests, and they create artificial social movements where they pay supporters to support enable their views, and they engage in extensive advertising. So likewise, I think we have problems of spectatorship that arise from the power of the institutions of global governance. So this is all stuff you know, but I'm just setting out the frame in terms of the WTO, the World Bank, and the IMF, and the fact that people are removed from their deliberations. At best, we're represented by appointees from our own governments. So these issues, these problems are often chalked up to or attributed to issues of scale, and as you've heard here, and also voter apathy, malaise, and so forth. But I want to challenge that framing of the issue in this paper. And we have to question, I think, whether it is in fact issues of scale that are the primary cause of spectatorship, and whether apathy and cynicism are properly identified as the explanation for people's lack of participation. Instead, it may well be that it's the barriers to participation themselves that are the main cause of cynicism. And so without denying altogether the relevance of issues of scale or the problem of cynicism, if not of apathy, I want in the first place to call attention to what we could call the elephant in the room, in terms of the root of these democratic deficits and of the lack of participation by people in contemporary politics. In particular, I suggest that the problem stems from the modern linking of democracy with a capitalist economic system. So capitalism is the elephant. Because I think that undermines democracy's egalitarian and active participatory dimensions. So most criticisms of democracy sort of neglect that, and I want to highlight it, and also consider what framing the problem in that way suggests in terms of dealing with this particular causal factor, not to say it's the only one. I do think that capitalism, on the other hand, as Marx himself recognized, also has contributed to some degree to the spread of democracy, especially in its liberal aspects, in terms of the formation, in terms of the idea of the free labor contract, the equality that's involved in exchange. So it has been a double-sided matter. But I think that Marx's deep critique of the inadequacies of this market conception, and especially of the exploitation involved in capitalism, need to be taken very seriously. And constructively as well, a perspective that generally speaking has roots in that tradition, would emphasize the importance for people of access to the basic conditions that they need in order to develop themselves, in order to become fully, to be able to make choices that are effective choices. And in my own work, this has given rise to what I call the norm of positive freedom, of course not in Berlin's unfortunate transformation of that notion, but in the sense of basically an equal right of people to the conditions for their own self-development, self-transformation over time, which I take to be not just an individual matter, but also to involve joint activity with others, collective action, in ways that I have worked out in my book. But if one takes this idea of access to the conditions of agency seriously, then it involves also, of course, the ability to sustain oneself through means of, not just means of subsistence, but the conditions for an adequate life. And in the present formation, that involves basically working for the few people who do control the means of production. So the problem that Marx noted, and that I basically think needs to be highlighted, is that this results in people being under the control of those who they have to work for people who own the means of production, and they do that in exchange for a salary or wage. But more problematic, perhaps, is the lack of control over one's own work activity that results from this situation. In addition, as Thomas Piketty has recently shown, there's a tendency of this present economic system to generate greater and greater concentration of wealth, not only to generate income inequality, which is an important problem, but it is also an inequality of wealth. So this is familiar to you all, but I think that the result of it is that people do not have much control over their ordinary life activity, and so they do have the opportunities for some degree of this kind of decision-making and control in leisure activity, but not in work activity, and certainly not in politics, where politics comes under the control of this enormous concentrations of wealth and income that is carried out by, or held by, the few. This is particularly clear in the United States, where the politics, democracy, so-called, is undermined by the power of wealth. But I think that's kind of like its pure form to which the situation is tending. So this is a very radical account, as you see. But I think that it gives rise to rather a different direction, which is not necessarily revolutionary. But in fact, I think that the framing of the problem suggests ways of dealing with it that can be implemented. And likewise, with respect to citizen apathy and cynicism, I think that this view underestimates people's capacities and interest in active participation. And there are signs of that interest and of their own activity that I want to highlight, which primarily takes social forms at present. You can see it online and the interactivity of Web 2.0, which I will get to. But I think, therefore, we have to look at what I would suggest is one of the main root problems for spectatorship. And in addition, at work, too, I don't think people are satisfied with their work situation. There's a lot of evidence to the effect that they're not, with a lack of control. It's actually been shown to be quite bad for your health, that your health is correlated with the degree of control that you have over your own work environment, the degree of active input that you have into it. So the overall framework suggests a very different conception of democracy, which I've argued for in my own work, which harks back to, I guess, Dewey's idea of democracy as a way of life. It's a conception of democracy which is not limited to just voting and not limited to electoral politics and parties, but does see the democracy tied to active input to some degree, decision-making about a range of activities, and is tied to forms of reciprocity, even in social life and even in the private sphere. So I can't get into all of that here, but I did want to suggest that framing. So, what I call for generally is what I term interactive democracy, which is a conception of democracy based on social interaction, which takes much more seriously the social context of our life activity rather than just the political ones, and which also argues for interaction among democracies in ways that I won't go for here. And it's also the title of my new book, so I give myself a little plug there. So what I want to do in the paper is sketch some arenas for this kind of active and interactive democratic participation that follows from this framing of the problem of spectatorship that I think addresses the core, the causes of, to some degree, of our lack of opportunities for participation in the political sphere, properly so-called. So the first one is a proposal concerning democratic management at work, which addresses the problems of exploitation and domination in the work process and introduces forms of democracy that actually are rather general. My argument for democratic management, as you'll see, applies really to a very broad range of arenas and not just political, strictly speaking. And I believe that, as John Stuart Mill and Carol Pateman have argued, the process of participation is educative, so that opportunities for participation outside of the political sphere, properly so-called, that is to say at work and in social life, actually will enable people to develop their active side, which to me is a core feature of being human. So in the paper, which is rather long and it's drawn from my book, I begin with a review of the situation with respect to cooperatives, which have 800 million members worldwide. The UN called 2012 the International Year of Cooperatives. Just to point out that that form of work, of organization of work, is extremely well developed and very powerful. The top 300 cooperatives generate as much as the 10th largest economy in the world, for example, with revenues of $1.1 trillion. Likewise, even in the United States, there are 11,000 employee-owned companies, and 6 million more than belong to private sector unions. 130 million Americans participate in the ownership of co-op businesses and credit unions, and so forth. So there's, this is a serious form of the organization of work. Perhaps some of you have traveled to the Basque region of Spain to observe Mondragon, and it's an amazing example of worker management and worker control. Mondragon is the 6th largest corporation in Spain and is entirely worker managed. They do bus frames, and they do washing machines, and they have finance, and it's very, very impressive indeed. So that's an existence proof that that it doesn't mean that if something is worker managed, it will not succeed or it will not be profitable. There's also a lot of other examples of this in Latin America and in Europe, in Emilia-Romagna, in the U.S., in the plywood cooperatives, and so forth. So in the paper, I actually think there are complications for this, which I also address. I'll just point to the problem of course, when we focus on just firms, increasingly they are spread out transnationally along with the institutions of global governance. A lot of the organization of work has become much more disparate and spread out. People don't necessarily work for firms. So in the paper, I actually have proposals that apply both to the firm and to those who work outside it. As we know, people are affected at a distance by what happens in a given firm or in a given nation state. Moreover, people's autonomy may be impacted who are not members of the firm. So my argument is more to identify membership, as we do with citizenship, which I, by the way, think is a problematic term because it should really, in the case of political communities, should apply to all those resident on a territory. So I prefer the term member to the term citizen, which is exclusionary. I think wherever you can identify members who are engaged in a common activity, there is a right of those to participate in the decision-making concerning it. So I think this applies to firms. It applies to social institutions of various sorts, including universities, but of course not equally to faculty as students who are transient. But I think it does apply in those cases with which we are familiar. And it applies to political communities. There are equal rights to take part in the decision-making. And this is what democracy amounts to, is that right, an equal right to participate in the decisions of which you are a member. Now, so it isn't justified in this context where we can identify these determinate institutions. It's not justified by all those who are affected. The problem with the all-affected principle is that it's too broad because people, future generations are affected, people at a distance are affected, decisions have unintended consequences. However, I think there is a role for the all-affected principle in my overall work, and it applies also to the new organization of work. It applies as much or more so with respect to the new forms of politics that we see that are impacted by globalization. There is a role for the all-affected principle, and that's with respect to the exogenous impacts of the decisions by communities and institutions on those at a distance. Where people at a distance are affected, I argue, in a certain specification, because it can't just be everyone affected, it has to be importantly affected. What's importantly affected? Affected in their capacity to realize their basic human rights is my proposal. Where they are impacted in their ability to fulfill basic human rights, they have rights, it seems to me, of democratic input into the decision, not equal rights of participation, at least not for the present. So that I work out in my overall view, but it affects the situation of work as well because increasingly workplaces are spread out, and you also have suppliers, and you have consultants, and you have the impact on distant communities of large-scale corporate actors. For all of those kinds of cases, as for political impacts, I argue for increasing new forms of rights of input into the decision in question. So without undercutting your comment, I do want to clarify that it's sort of not fair because I got to read it, that the argument is for rights of participation, not obligations to participate, equal rights of participation. I do not think that people have to participate. However, I think that the argument I've given supports equal rights of participation. The problem is we don't have a choice. to participate or not. So the option needs to be there, and that requires really a fundamental transformation of work. The problem is that people don't get opportunities to control their own lives in various ways, or to jointly control it. And so the opportunity has to be there. They don't necessarily have to make use of it, so it's not a kind of Republican idea that you have to fulfill yourself through participation necessarily, although there are cases where I do think one has certain obligations that one could go into. Okay, so this is based on a more social conception of our activity, it seems to me, but it also respects individual freedom, and it's based on a social ontology, as I've called it, my term, individuals and relations, which we could go into as well. So, of course, the argument against this are work is different because workers can leave a firm and work for some other firm, or there's the right of exit, so the people argue, and there's no coercion, some others argue. And here I would fall back on really basically a Marxist analysis to suggest that although workers are not free, are free to work for any firm, they're not free not to work for all of them. And so in every case, they're going to be bound into a situation of basically of exploitative work because of the present organization of the production process. So I'm not proposing at this point, some kind of total transformation of capitalism, but I think that a step that would be very helpful is this idea of self-management, which is in the first place a call for, if possible, full worker control, but short of that, which because of the difficulties of introducing it, opportunities for democratic participation in management, by which I mean joint control by people who work in a firm of the conditions of work, of the work process, and the appointment of managers. So they don't all have to decide everything. There are a lot of sort of silly criticisms of this view, but if you go to Mondragon, you'll see that it can work indeed. And it makes a real difference in terms of the activity and the opportunities that people feel to have the possibilities of appointing and removing managers or being one yourself. Okay, so then in the paper I discuss the problems of the spread out nature of work, but because I want to and the spread out nature of politics, increasingly transnational. And there are ways of introducing greater input into even the institutions of global governance, but that points to the second, I actually have three parts, but I'm going to just focus on and sort of agglomerate the second and third parts of the paper. How am I doing time-wise?
7 minutes. Yeah. 7 minutes.
Okay, so the second part might seem very different, but it's related in some ways, which has to do with the new forms of networking. Let's put it that way, to summarize, to pull together the two aspects. Networking, both in terms of social movements, the paper deals with transnational solidarity movements, as well as networking, online networking. And I think that this is a very interesting and important set of developments, not determined by the technology, but making use of it, new ways of organizing that are horizontal and that are represent new forms of power, which I also discuss as democratic networking power. So I think that this view of just the common activities thing is part of the story, but the other dimension are the new forms of transnational linkages as well as within nation states that are established by social movements and that are also established online. I've discussed this a lot elsewhere, but it's the idea that that these social movements are not necessarily made up of just individuals or just groups, but they are networked with each other Each group may have, like NGOs, may have their own separate main goals and so forth, but they agree to work together with not necessarily full consensus, but implicit consensual agreement, at least for certain purposes. We've seen this mostly with respect to alleviating suffering in many cases after natural disasters, the various hurricanes, and Hurricane Sandy was one that affected us, but in Indonesia, elsewhere, where people are moved to aid. But also with respect to eliminating oppression, various social groups, social movements oriented to justice concerns and improving the situation with respect to oppression. And so they, these kinds of transnational solidarities are quite different from the older idea of solidarity within a given nation state, but involve standing in solidarity with other groups, with other movements, and working towards common goals. I think this is a very interesting phenomenon. It exemplifies forms of empathy and forms of mutual aid. There's an implicit reciprocity and so forth that I've worked out, but I don't have time to develop here. But they are horizontally organized, or at least try to be, and they're voluntary associations for the most part. Jeffrey Juris wrote an interesting article reflecting on networks in connection with the Occupy Wall Street movement. He distinguishes between a networking logic and an aggregative logic. The networking logic for him involves institutions that link up for certain purposes or groups, whereas for him the aggregative logic is just people coming together for certain purposes. And he thinks that Occupy Wall Street exemplified mainly aggregative logic, using Twitter and to mobilize at a given location, and people came as individuals. I actually think that's pretty much wrong for Occupy. It's partly right, and that there isn't a sharp distinction. These two are intertwined in practice, networking logic and aggregative logic. I identify the networking logic is facilitated by the internet as a network of networks, sort of consciously designed by scientists to be decentralized and for its networking capabilities with respect to communication and information. The aggregative one is also manifest online in forms of crowdsourcing. So in the paper, I go on to discuss some of these very interesting new uses of both networking and crowdsourcing online for democratic purposes or quasi-democratic purposes. So far, they've mainly taken the form of social networking. There are some interesting uses, and the whole discussion of Web 2.0 points out the new user-generated content, Wikipedia, video conferencing, live blogging, live streaming. But some new uses of it for political purposes can be highlighted and, in fact, will be developed, I'm sure. You had the Icelandic constitution amendments that were drafted by, 1 minute, let me get them straight, because there's Iceland and there's Ireland. They both used it. One used crowdsourcing. That was Ireland. No, deliberation. No, I've got it wrong. Yeah. I've got it. I'm jet lagged. Let me just get this straight, and then I'll stop shortly.
Ireland did a lesser version of what Iceland did. Yeah.
Pardon?
Ireland did a lesser version of what Iceland did.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so Iceland was a crowdsourced thing with 25 members of the public initially drafting proposals for their constitution, which was subject to a referendum and subsequent action by Parliament. They received comments from Facebook and Twitter. Yeah, I think there's a political scientist who's been very instrumental in the Iceland use. And the Ireland case was more an example of deliberation through polling. they had a constitutional convention in 2012 made up of a total of 100 representative citizens and parliamentarians. So I wanted to indicate that these participative uses of the internet supplement the deliberative ones, which have been the focus of a lot of political theory. To the degree there's been a discussion, it's like deliberative software and so forth. But I think it's even more interesting, at least to supplement those possible deliberations online with some of these more participative things that have come into focus, which is both the use of the internet for networking as integrated within social movements and their transnational linkages. So it's not like the internet's going to solve the problems, but as used as an instrumentality by social movements that want to link up. But also these crowdsourcing uses that emphasize the interactivity of the web and that give people at a distance the opportunity to participate. In the paper, I note many of the problems that can also come in, that come into play with the internet. So I don't think we should be overly romantic, so you can figure out some other questions to ask me instead of that one, which is an obvious challenge. You know, it's real big problems with surveillance, using Facebook, with thin relationships online, with hate groups online, and so forth. So I think all of this is the case. But it also has these potentialities for our uses. And there is a lot of interaction and networking going on. So the question is, building on people's interest in some degree of joint control over their own lives, joint freedom in their own activity with others, whether this can be built on. One other example I just want to conclude with is the participatory budgeting case, which is, of course, from Porto Alegre in Brazil. But I want to let you know that it's now been adopted by several council districts in New York City. So we have participatory budgeting as a new direction in New York City as well as in your Latin American cases. So I really think that people have an interest in it. They do sometimes show a degree of concern, even with people at a distance, so some degrees of empathy, some degrees of concern with the human rights of others. And instead of any counsel of despair or simply trying to propose that we should redistribute to benefit the least well-off, or we just regulate the well-off, although those are very important short-term proposals, I think we need to look at the deeper causes of the lack of participation in politics.
Thank you very much, Carol. Now there's some time for Rowan from the University of Stirling.
I just want to take some sugar in. I didn't have time to do this before.
Well, you're not jet-lagged, so...
I'm not jet-lagged. I'm always tired. I'm sugar-lagged. Okay, sorry, now I can't speak. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks very much. I really liked Carol Gould's paper, which in some ways made it a bit hard as a commentator. I thought, yes, I kept thinking. So I found a few things to say, but it's with a background of yes. So I think her paper is important for its focus on how capitalism can create barriers to democratic participation. Within the debate on Scottish independence, I remember hearing the claim that simply by becoming a smaller state with fewer inhabitants, we'll be able to solve some problems of democratic participation. And Gould's paper makes clear that simply going small and local isn't enough. We need institutions and systems that remove barriers and enable participation at a range of levels that foster democracy as a way of life, as she calls it. So Gould starts by arguing for democratisation of the workplace, and I just want to say a bit about that at the start. She's got this three-stage argument, which she just sketched for you. First, she says, and this is a quote from the paper, there's a right of those who are engaged in common or joint activity to co-determine the direction and course of that activity. Secondly, she says that common or joint activity with others is essential for people's self-development or self-transformation. And thirdly, Gould says, quote again, that since they're equally agents in these contexts, no one of them has the right to dominate or exploit others in this context, and they must instead have equal rights to determine these activities. And from this, Gould concludes that there's a case for significant expansion of equal worker control of firms, And later she adds that there's also a case for differential control of firms by outsiders whose human rights are affected by firms' activities. Now, when I first read the case, I thought, OK, I can imagine critics questioning each stage of this argument or pressing on how they should be interpreted. I mean, you could say, do participants in joint activities really have a right to co-determine their direction? Here I am taking part in Edinburgh University's research activities. Does that give me, an employee of Stirling University, a right to some say in Edinburgh's research policies? Is joint activity really essential for humans? Some people point to hermits or desert islanders to say that they get by OK. And I think most vulnerable is the claim that we're each equal joint participants in our firm. Contemporary culture values the entrepreneur above the employee, and when I discuss the relationships within capitalism, many of my students deny that each labourer plays an equal role. But I don't want to pursue any of these worries. I thought the claims were defensible and persuasive. I see them as springing from the attractive view that we should pay more attention to the joint aspect of important joint activities, more attention to what we do as a we. And my first critical comment was simply to ask how far we should take Gould's rights of co-determination. And when I first read Gould's paper, I thought we should go further than what she was suggesting. She argues, here's a quote, for all those working in the firm to have rights to participate equally in fundamental management decisions, including concerning their own conditions of work, and in the stronger case, concerning the appointment of managers. And this made it sound as though her focus was on democratic control of the workplace construed as control of the conditions in which you work and your managers. And this seemed a bit narrow. If, as I think we should, we agree with Gould and Marx that the joint activities of work are essential for a good human life, and that such joint activities generate joint rights of control, then it seems quite restricting to narrow these rights to the kind of rights that unions focus on, rights over one's working conditions and managers. In a way, what this does, I think, is home in on what we might call the consumption aspects of work, the sort of daily experience of work and of its essential power relations. But if joint work's essential to a good life, shouldn't people also have rights of control over production decisions, not just over how they experience producing their product, but whether it's produced, what it is? Basically, shouldn't we all be managers? And you can develop a case for this from Marx's early claim that work should be pursued for its own sake as well as for the sake of survival. I think to engage in work for its own sake, you need to see the product and the act of producing as things you want to do for their own sake. And this requires you to get stuck in and engage with the overall point of your work by playing your part in collective management decisions. Okay, so I thought this was a criticism of Carol when I first read the paper. Then we emailed yesterday and I realised I just missed part of it, and actually her position is the same as mine anyway in that respect. Even though I thought her conclusions were a bit narrower, she is pressing for really quite extensive joint management, and she was mentioning Mondragon at the start of her own talk a minute ago. So she is committed to the Marxist view that unalienated work must be done for its own sake, and hence to the importance of full control over one's productive activities. But this then prompts a second question. Do full rights of control for workers, do they create stresses and strains for those who want to opt out of big production decisions? Or to put this in the terms of the conference, is spectatorship always a problem, or is it sometimes a legitimate choice? I guess I was thinking often employers resist too much involvement in managerial decisions on the grounds they'd rather not have to make such decisions. Of course, giving someone a right to participate is not the same as forcing them to participate. But sometimes even just giving someone an option can be a cost for them. And I think it was Velleman has this case where he mentioned a trivial case where you don't want to be invited to a party because you'd rather have an evening at home without having to justify it. Just getting the invitation, getting that option is a kind of cost to you, the pain of having to then think up an excuse or feel guilty or whatever. What's that? Sorry?
Poor dear.
Yeah, poor dear, exactly. Such a tough case. But we could try and apply the same point to the serious case of employee control. Would some people rather not have the option of making managerial decisions because they'll then have to justify getting involved or staying as spectators? You have to think, okay, I don't want to do that. That becomes a much tougher thing to argue if you could do it. And behind this is, I think, a really interesting question about the value of participation. Is participation always a good? And if so, is it something we can trade off for other goods such as tranquility? Gould resists the possibility of such a trade-off concerning communal activities. I can't legitimately choose to retire into my private sphere and take no part in communal activities. For Gould, joint action is just too important for this. But how extensive are the implications of this claim? I mean, are students letting themselves and others down when they fail to complete module evaluation questionnaires? And returning to my earlier point, employees failing themselves in each other if they choose jobs with few managerial responsibilities and allow themselves to be driven by others' decisions. And I have to say, I'm just unsure how to answer this. I'm quite wary of dismissing those who don't want much control over where they work, those who treat the workplace as a mere means to their income, and who'd rather not have to think about a right to participate further. And I'm not sure I want to say that such people are simply making an erroneous or timid choice which they nonetheless have a right to make. It's not clear to me the choice of spectatorship really is timid or erroneous for everyone. And towards the end of her paper, Gould mentions the problem of cross-cultural understanding or misunderstanding within democratic deliberation. I think it's worth mentioning this can also happen within one culture. I think if we've got too ready a sense that spectators must be cynical or apathetic or simply mistaken in their negative evaluation of participation, this could be a manifestation of a sort of intracultural misunderstanding. Where I'm saying we who like participation are misunderstanding them. Just failing to see the point of being a spectator. I mean, a strong Marxist response would claim that those who don't want the option of control over the workplace and the firm are in some sense victims of false consciousness. But this response seems sort of patronising. And Geoffrey Green's paper is relevant here, of course. I mean, Green's response differs from Marx's. For Green, an Epicurean withdrawal from political activities, and we could add a withdrawal from control over the workplace, is a form of therapy for those doomed to limited power. And while this isn't patronising like an accusation of false consciousness, I'm just, as I said before, I'm not sure I want to go along with the negative connotation of therapy, something we'd do better not to have to fall back on. That's the idea of therapy. It would be better if we didn't have to have it. I'm tempted instead, in a sense, to take the Epicurean case on its own terms. Perhaps a good life, at least for some people, can or even should involve spectatorship in the public spheres of politics and work, with participation reserved for private friendships and family. This stance need not be dismissed as therapy, but simply as an accurate measure of what a good life should be. And I think when I don't really believe this, but when I think myself round to this way of thinking, I think, there is something attractive about those who get on with their own life rather than seeking political results or career advancement. Think about the way we praise people who are modest rather than careerist. Think about the common wish that we could elect representatives who don't want to be elected, rather than having to choose among those who've already tainted themselves by putting themselves up for election. So kind of a wish to withdraw looks like a good thing. So here's a brief summary then of my two suggestions so far. First, it seems to me that Gould's case for democratising the workplace supports full worker control, not restricted to control over conditions of work or managers. Secondly, I just can't decide whether to say that those who think they'd be better off without control over their joint activities, so those who choose to be alienated in Marx's sense, I can't decide whether to say they're mistaken. I think we should be wary of dismissing this response hastily. And just to pick up something Carol added in her presentation a minute ago, I mean, you were saying it's only a right to participation, you're not forcing people to do this, you don't have to use this right. That is correct. I mean, it still seems to me that whether participation is a good for you is relevant to the justification of that right. So if suppose you're one of these people for whom participation just isn't good, you do much better as an Epicurean, should you still have a right to it? Well, if we're saying you should, it must be not because of what it does for you, because we just said it doesn't do anything for you, because of what this right does for other people. Maybe we say we're going to give you this right so that you can be a useful check on political power. And my sense is if we ground the right on what it does for others, it's hard to see that right as a sort of fundamental right. My sense is our most fundamental rights, things like the right not to be tortured, are grounded in what they do for us as individual right holders. And if we can't find something that the right does for us, then there might still be a case for this right, but it's in some sense not such a strong case, I'm tempted to say. If we say we're giving you this right to participate because instrumentally you'll be a useful check on power, even though you would actually be better withdrawing and being away on your own. Makes that right seem less fundamental to me, that right to participate. Okay, so those were comments on the sort of the right to participate in the workplace point. In the later sections of her paper, Gould claims that online networking offers possibilities for social movements and democratic deliberation within politics that can engage those who would otherwise be spectators. And I really like these claims. I also liked Gould's awareness of the limits of online networking. She mentioned the way it excludes those who lack access online, the way it allows reactionary forces to entrench their positions. My main further point relates to Gould's two focal points. I just want to consider the possibility of a third. So Gould looks at democratisation of the workplace. Then she looks at the use of the internet to democratise political participation. So we've got democracy in the workplace and in politics. What about the democratisation of consumption? Should we take Gould's points about the need for joint activity, and hence participation rights in the workplace and the political sphere, and apply them equally to the sphere of consumption? For example, is there a human need for joint consumption in the same way that, says Marx, we need joint productive activities? And again, I'm not sure of the answer here, but I do find a positive answer tempting. You know, just as we should think of ourselves as collective producers and not solely focus on our own individual narrow contribution, shouldn't we think the same way about we as a joint consumer? Such a way of thinking could clarify our handling maybe of environmental problems. And certainly it seems to me that a norm of equal control over consumption is attractive, whether or not it's grounded in the notion that consumption is a joint activity. We might then think about how to deliver rights of equal control over consumption. So tax cuts and privatisation, these are sometimes defended as returning power to us, the people. And this only works if we, the people, as consumers, hold equal rights over our joint consumption. Otherwise, as is obvious, tax cuts and privatisation simply redirect power from the democratic populace to wealthy consumers. The wealthy to stress there. So to ensure equal control as consumers, we need to remove the excess weight supplied by others' greater or lesser wealth. And one interesting option which modern technology might make possible would be wealth-graded or income-graded purchase taxes. So imagine if when you come to buy a meal in a restaurant, your bank card places you in wealth group X rather than Y, and as a result, value-added tax is applied at 30% rather than 20% to your purchase. Here, technological possibilities enable a sort of democratisation of consumption, in that taxation is used at the point of consumption in order to counterbalance how inequalities in wealth impede equal consumption participation. Consumer power, I think, would have a more democratic meaning in this situation, as it would not, as it does today, mean the power of consumers weighted by how wealthy they are. Now, one of the reasons I mentioned that wealth-graded purchase tax possibility is just to highlight how the new IT technologies bring with them huge risks of excessive government power. I think about the databases governments would use to run my new tax. It's an obvious worry for this proposal, and I can see similar problems for some of Gould's suggestions about electronic democracy. Are the chances that the new technologies will and have empowered those who would otherwise be excluded, are they any greater than that they'll reproduce and consolidate current power imbalances? I'm just a bit sceptical. I fear new technology, by facilitating new means of communication, does as much for the oppressors as the oppressed. So I'd be interested to hear about empirical research on this. I actually don't know much about it. Perhaps I'm wrong there. Right, just to sum up, I've got a tiny bit more to say. In sum, Gould outlines a very strong normative case for increasing participation both in the workplace and in politics. I want to end by going back to my point from earlier, which is that whether we should accept the case for increasing participation depends fundamentally on whether and to what extent spectatorship is a morally or prudentially problematic choice. If participation is for many people not a good but a cost, then perhaps we should be thinking of alternative ways of regulating the workplace and politics, ways that do without participation. You could have regulated capitalism or constitutionally governed politics. But I should confess that on balance I'm definitely with Gould, with Marx, with Cicero in thinking participation is an essential good for the participant, and I hope one of the aims of today's workshops is to clarify why that's right, why it really is so good for you. Thank you.
Oh, okay, well, thank you for those very serious and interesting comments. Just a few points. I think we need to think about what is participation. What does it mean? I don't know that we're really clear on that. In my view, it's tied to our agency if you take people to be engaged frequently in joint activities with others and not just as individuals. And it is tied to our individual agency in the sense of, I mean, it's in common with liberal views. I do think of people as, choosers, as intentional agents over time. But I want to emphasize the ways that this is a process of growth and development of people through their lives, as well as involving in which they need access to various conditions. So it isn't, you can't just decide to go to China unless you have the money to get there. Pure choice isn't enough. But also you need the basics of various sorts, which I think are specified in human rights. But in addition, a lot of our activity is joint, and that's not just in politics per se as citizens, but it's in all kinds of contexts, both of social life, economic life, and even on smaller scales where we decide to do things together. So in those contexts where people are doing things together, it seems to me that it isn't right for one person to decide. They should have equal rights to decide. Because in the extreme case where one decides what the other should do without their participation, it consists of domination. So I think which is a violation of their freedom, of their equal freedom. of their freedom as agents. So it basically, we have to reflect on what participation is. And the idea is that some domains of common activity are essential. Engaging in common activity in various contexts of our life are essential. I don't think we can say in advance which ones will be essential for each individual, and therefore there's an argument for their having equal rights to decide about any of the common or joint activities in which they engage. I don't think you can determine in advance that it should just be purely political, where we do grant people equal rights. So wherever they are, you can identify institutional contexts, it seems to me, for the most part, although there's a correlate for the more interpersonal and social, truly, which would be friendship. Wherever you can identify, or doing things together, wherever you can identify joint or common activities, people would have a right to participate. So participation, to the degree that it's tied to their agency in some way, it would be inevitable, or maybe a good, if you want to put it that way. But it isn't necessarily, not in the sense, a repressive sense in which they have to take part. They can choose, but I'm just arguing they should have the opportunities everywhere where they're engaged in common activities. So the New York Times recently had an article, "Why Do People Hate Work?" That was the title of it. So I just want to call your attention to the fact that most people don't enjoy their work. And so it isn't really just work for its own sake. I really want to focus on the relations of domination and exploitation as the most problematic feature of work. But also worldwide, I'm almost done. Worldwide, work is often really quite oppressive. And it's not just oppressive because of the control and domination, but it's repetitive and so forth. It's very minimal. I think the problem is not just hating work in advanced societies, but the oppressive nature of it around the world, and that it doesn't bring the means of life. I could say something about consumption too, but I just would say that a lot of the distributive features of contemporary life follows from the organization of the production process. So the fact that people get so little is because they have to work for people who control the production process. And so then we have to fix it up with distribution. But I think we have to look both at distribution, distributive justice requirements, and the organization of the work process, production process.
Thank you, Carol.